don't actually have control to drag that over.
Colonel Tim.
So if you can just hit the merge button.
That's easy.
Tim 1, Tim 2.
We're trying to make it easy for you, Barry. Got to do our part.
It is hot. Well, welcome everyone. We apologize for the late start here, trying to work through some technical challenges. And you'll forgive us if we don't actually look at the screen, those of us who are on the ends of the table, if we're having this discussion here, because we are having a discussion with the people who are at the table. And so in a few moments, I will go ahead and allow everyone here to introduce themselves, and I will kick it off. But my name is Keith McCullough. I am the pastor of Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. I'm also a member of the Community Action Team, along with Chief here. I serve as a board member on Ethnos College, a Christian college here in Fauquier County. I also serve as a board member of Shalom Outreach Ministries, which does international ministries, helping specifically churches that are primarily black do foreign missions. My other hat is I'm a founding member of Covenant Christian Academy at Vint Hill. I also serve as a trustee, at that particular school. And I'm sure there's some other hats that I wear, but we'll just leave it right there for now. So we'll go around and we'll start across from me with Barry.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Barry Newman. I am a local resident of Fauquier since inception, essentially. All my family's from the area. They're dispersed out throughout the county, now throughout the nation at this point. I'm a big advocate for housing. I'm a big advocate for equal rights and just overall just taking care of your neighbor, essentially. I've served in the Navy for quite a few years, and I'm now back in the local area just trying to support the best I can to ensure that the next generation and my current generation are being accounted for. So with that, I'll pass, and again, my name is Barry. I'll pass the mic over to Lieutenant Colonel Retired Tim. Yeah.
Hi, I go by Tim. I tell everybody my pronouns are Colonel and Sir. I am from an Army family, so I didn't grow up in Virginia. My family originated from Texas, from the San Antonio area. At least that's where my grandfather was stationed, but he came into the Army from Arkansas. I grew up as an Army brat, lived all over the world, went to 10 different schools in 12 years growing up. So I was the proverbial new kid in school all the way through grammar school and high school. I then joined the Army, went to West Point, graduated, and again have served all over the world as an infantry officer. And then, like many in the Army, they send you to the Pentagon where old colonels go to die. And I stayed there because I had some particular skills that the Office of Secretary of Defense needed. So I converted to a civil servant. I think it's important to understand that I hope I bring a perspective to this panel that I've lived all over the United States, lived in 12 different states, and went to school in 5 or 6 of them. And I've visited over 25 to 30 countries and have actually lived in 5 different countries in the Middle East, in Europe, and in East Asia. So if I sound like I'm bringing kind of a different tweak to things, I hope I do, because sometimes we get a little narrowly focused on just the problems in the United States, and I think many of the problems that we have in the United States are really global problems. They're not just peculiar to us. So I'll turn over the mic to Colonel Chief Tim, who prefers to go by Tim, and let him lay out his background.
All right, let me make sure I got that right. So my name is Timothy Carter. I'm the Chief of Police of the Warrenton Police Department. Like Barry, I'm also Fauquier County born and raised. I currently live in Culpeper County, but don't disown me for that. Product of the Fauquier County school system, and as the chief, now going into my second full year of the Warrenton Police Department and being very intimately knowledge with the town and the Fauquier County government and the people, what I'm trying to do, quite frankly, is to use my position to make change in the things that I've seen in the 32 years that I've been a police officer, those things that I think need addressing, and appropriately so, many of those things involve law enforcement and law enforcement's engagement with the community, and so that's a large part of where my heart is. You can refer to me as Tim.
All right. And so before we get started, and we've kind of talked about this a little offline, but just so that everyone who is watching either here live or online is aware, our rules of engagement, we're not here to argue. We're here to have a discussion. Again, we want to be able to present our viewpoint without attacking the viewpoint of another group, whether they're here in the building at the table, or elsewhere. And again, I believe that everyone at this table is mature enough to be able to do that. I'm not going to put a timer on your responses unless you start acting like a preacher. There's only one preacher at the table, and he's not allowed to go too long. But I don't want to, so if you need to set up context for your response, is what I'm saying, feel free to do so. Because I know sometimes people try to nail you down to a yes or no, but there's context behind your yes or no, and we want to make sure that we gather that. So our discussion today is around how relevant is the civil rights movement in the 21st century. Now, I don't believe I'm going to get much argument, on the first question. Is it still relevant in the 21st century? Now, again, if you need to, give some context to your response, feel free to do so. We'll start with Chief here.
All right. Thank you. Just want to make sure I didn't hit a wrong button here, because I thought I did for a second there and I was going to be off. So Pastor McCullough, I will definitely say that civil rights movement is relevant in the 21st century. I think it's, quite frankly, if you look at, say, just in this century, some of the things that we've been dealing with as a people, I think it's just a difference in how we approach some of the problems that we have, right? So, the civil rights movement of the 60s was largely the working class, But now that we find that in the 21st century, we have the opportunity, because of the advances that were made in the civil rights movement of the 60s, we have the opportunity to have people in positions of power, people in positions of influence, that can have an effect, that can help to move forward those things. So, I'll use just a brief example of something that I am involved with as a law enforcement officer. Is, if we just go back, we can go back to just 2012 with Trayvon Martin, and then just pull forward from there in what we've seen in our country with police relations with the community, and some of the very unfortunate things that have happened with regard to, and I will put this lightly, I will say deaths that have occurred at the hands of law enforcement officers. And I think there are many different, it's not just a simple black and white, it's kind of nuanced, there's many different things that go into that, but the bottom line that I see as a law enforcement officer is, in many ways, what we're looking at is places in our nation that have not progressed to where they need to be, whether it's in their engagement with the community, whether it's within their policies, in their mindset, in how they engage with the public. We can look back and find many instances just in the past 10 to 15 years of situations that did not have to be what they were. People who have lost their lives at the hands of law enforcement officers, and it did not need to happen. I'm using that as my example. And in our community, I can tell you that what we strive to do as a law enforcement agency is to have that communication, that transparency, but more importantly than that, that involvement from the community. It's not about us going and telling the community what we're doing. It's about involving the community in what we're doing, and hence our community action team that Pastor McCall, that you spoke about. It's about bringing in representatives and members of the community to see the inner workings of what we do, to help us, to help bring us into, if we're not already there, but if we're already there, to keep us in to what are best policing practices in the 21st century. So I think in wrapping up, I think the civil rights movement of the 60s paved the way for those reforms, those necessary social reforms that we needed, and I think that kicked the door open to where we are today. And so what we see today with protests of many different, in many different manners, those are trying to build upon the civil rights movement of the 60s. And I think I'll just leave it at that. I think that's a good start, but that's how I feel about that. Thank you.
So, like I said, I probably have a little bit of different perspective. The Army desegregated in 1947. I was born in 1951. So by the time I was going to school, I lived in fully integrated communities. Black officers in particular you didn't see very many back in the 50s and 60s, but progressively over my time in association with the Army, we have seen the ranks being filled pretty equitably by senior NCOs who are African American, and toward the middle and the later parts of my career, we saw colonels and general officers increasingly going into power. And so I've worked with, and worked over black soldiers and Hispanics and Asian Americans my whole life. So my sense is that if you have a system that's designed for folks to meet standards, and you give them opportunities to acquire the skills so that they can meet those standards, they will excel. So I will say this, I've run into black soldiers in particular who were excellent. I mean, outstanding, some of the best soldiers I've ever met. I've served with some who were good. I've served with some who were mediocre, and I've served with some who were below standard. And I think I guess what I'm trying to say right now is we're at a stage now where we have to start thinking about standards and figure out how to implement those standards in a fairly egalitarian way. That's hard to do. I'm not saying that's easy, but it's hard to do. And my experience, at least, is when you set standards, people achieve them. So back to Tim's earlier comment, I would agree with him. I think I agree that civil rights is still an issue. But I would say the context has changed differently. The kinds of things that need to be done now are not the things that we needed to achieve 40 or 50 years ago when I was a young boy. So I'll give you an example. The first time I moved into a civilian community was 1964. We moved to a place called Delray Beach, Florida. In Delray Beach, Florida, the town was completely segregated. It was the first time I'd ever run into that form of segregation. About 100 yards from my house, the rental house that we lived in, was a wall. We kids called it the Berlin Wall. It was 10 feet tall, and it separated the white community from the black community. There were no black kids in our school system. All of the black kids went to the black schools. So this was complete foreign, it was anathema to me. It was a foreign experience, and you saw hardcore racism in that place at that time. If you went back to that town now, that fence no longer exists. All the community is integrated. The high schools are completely integrated. And while I'm sure not everything is perfect down there, it certainly doesn't reflect the environment that I saw when I was 12 years old at that time. So we have to remember, while things aren't perfect, we've come a really long way. And I'm kind of a glass half-filled guy. Let's say that while recognizing that there are still issues, we ought not denigrate what we've together achieved. I think the country has moved a great deal forward, despite the many things that we identified. In my view, it's healthy to criticize ourselves. for not doing the things that we ought to be doing. And to be frank, we're seeing civil rights issues now that are expanding beyond just black-white relations. And Tim and I were talking earlier about, slavery. Slavery's not gone. It's occurring in this country right now. If you think that all these children who came into this country are in nice households with loving parents, that's not happening. They're being abused. And that is a form of slavery. And they're not black children, they're predominantly Hispanic children. So, the dynamic is we still have a way to go, but the kinds of problems that we're trying to address now are much more multi-ethnic than they were. If you go into Appalachia, which is predominantly a white area, you have the same sorts of problems that you find in the inner city of, say, Chicago or Baltimore or Washington or San Francisco. They have drug problems, they have single-parent family problems, they have educational limitations, the schools are not up to snuff. All these things are problems that beset multiple communities and they are multi-ethnic problems. And they're problems that hold the whole country back. If you have kids growing up in single-family households, they're at a disadvantage. People say, well, you have white privilege. And I says, well, the white privilege I had is I had two parents who gave a damn about my education. They made sure that I had certain moral standards that are, not that I always lived up to them, but they expected that of me. And they enforced those standards. That was my privilege growing up. And so when I launched off into the world, and I would hope that Keith's kids or Tim's kids or anybody else's kids will have grown in that environment, they will have enjoyed that same privilege as well. Does that mean we can't improve upon our schools, that we can't improve upon our police departments, that we can't improve on how we vote and what kind of opportunities are available to people? Well, sure, we can. But I would just ask you, based on the perspective I've had, over my 73 years ago, as a token white old guy, I would say that we can't be too overly critical of ourselves. We still got a way to go, but I think we're doing better. And that's from the book of John.
Pastor, can you repeat the question one more time? Yeah.
Do you believe that the civil rights movement is still relevant in the 21st?
So based on the question, and I like each person's response, especially from the perspectives of kind of where they've been in life, I do believe it's still current. I think what we started, when I say we, our civil rights movement that we started back in the 60s and before that, was a door for essentially everyone else in the country to get access, right? I think that the access that we have been given is great. I think we need to do more. But I think at the same time, the access is that they're limited to pockets of certain areas, right, based on political affiliation, or if your city has more funds because you have more people to tax, right? So I think if we start providing access to those lower outlying cities and towns, so that way they can understand what is available for them to leverage in the community, or from a political, even from a government standpoint, I think some of this stuff will be more equitable across the board. But currently, because of where you might live or where you're born today, right? Because even certain countries, right? Because we do police, or not police, but we help with the other countries as well as far as funding. I think that's what's needed in order for the civil rights movement to be more effective. It's just the access. So my response is a little bit shorter, but I think it's access is what we need, and that's why it still needs to be continued today.
All right. Well, I appreciate all the responses. Some of what you said in the response to that question, we'll dig into a little bit deeper, as we go into some of the quotes from MLK. So I'm glad, but I'm also glad that no one said, no, it's not, because I didn't, have any questioning along those lines at all. So I would have to pull all that one up out of my head. But I figured we would all agree that it's still relevant in this day and age. So let's go to the first quote from MLK. And for those who are here, we do have it printed out, for you if you want to look at it also. And I gave it to the panelists here because sometimes it's easier to see it on paper than to hear someone else say it. So I'm going to read this quote from Martin Luther King's speech on "Give Us the Ballot." It was given at the Pilgrimage for Freedom on the heels of the Board versus Brown of Education decision on May 17th, 1957. And so this is what King stated: "Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will, by the power of our vote, write the law on the statute books of the South and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of Congress men who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who will do justly and love mercy, and we will place at the head of the Southern states governors who have felt not only the tang of human, but the glow of the divine. Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and nonviolently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17th, 1954. And again, that is on the heels of the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. And so when it comes to voting, because he spoke, about the ballot here, how relevant is the civil rights movement in the 21st century? When it comes to voting, how relevant is it? And I'll start with Barry this time.
So this is great. I mean, I just wish that MLK was here today to see why we vote and how we vote, right? Because I feel like sometimes we vote towards, well, at least for me, I vote for what's the better for the country, not necessarily voting for what always I believe is best for me, right? Because as a conservative Christian, I believed a lot of things, but at the same time, I have a lot of empathy, right? So I understand that, there's programs needed for people that might have access, right? There's programs needed for the government to maybe step in an interim basis to support whatever the initiative is to get kind of the people on the right track of what we are as a nation, right? So I think it's a loaded question, but I think the ballot, based on Martin Luther King's speech, the ballot is still important today. It's just we need to focus on what we're voting for, not necessarily because of affiliation or affiliation, essentially. Yeah, so that's...
So this is, again, something that I've kind of lived my life, watched it over the years. First of all, I'm pretty confident now that we don't have the kind of race-based laws that prevent minorities from voting right now. If you want to vote, you can vote. And we saw that in Atlanta in spades, where there's been a lot of concern about blacks in particular having access to the polls. But in the last election, they had a record turnout of minorities in Atlanta this past election. So before I continue, truth in lending, I am the chairman of the local Republican committee. So you'll see a certain conservative slant to what I'm saying. But like Barry, I have a lot of empathy.
Before you move on, I want to be clear that we extended the same invitation to the chair of the Democratic convention here in Fauquier County.
And by the way, he and I have a lot in common. We talk all the time. We really think civility between the two parties is critical at this stage. And he, like I, is a graduate of West Point. We understand dignity and respect, and that while you may not agree with somebody, you don't have to treat them terribly or with disdain. But so the ability to vote right now, I think the whole issue tied to identification is a red herring. If you have a driver's license, if you use that driver's license to buy alcohol, or you use it for any other purpose that's required, where identification is required, you can do that. I'm not black, but if I were black, I would be insulted if somebody assumed that I wasn't smart enough or had the ability to get a driver's license or to get some form of identification. That is not a barrier to voting anymore. Jim Crow laws are gone. And as far as I can tell, where I've lived, I've never seen anything of that. So in my view, in the ballot right now, the bigger issue is election integrity. That we have people who are eligible to vote can vote, and the people who are not eligible to vote should not vote. So that means you clean up your voter rolls of dead people. You clean up the rolls of people who've moved out of the state and the county. And that's not a black-white problem. That's an election integrity problem. And to the degree that we can have free and fair elections, we should all jointly think that's important. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you should want us to have elections in this country that are free and fair, and that whoever's the majority in that particular election, that should be unassailable. We should be confident in the quality of elections. Sadly, that's not the case today. And again, that's not a black-white problem. That's an election integrity problem. Now, to the degree that you vote for people, and this is where I'm putting on my Republican hat, that's why I identified myself as, I really believe that local and state elections are as important, if not even more important, than the federal elections. Why? Because you have to live with the laws and the rules that are established in this county and in the state. And so you ought to pay attention to who's representing you and whether that individual, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, represents the issues and the values that you perceive. So, for example, we have issues here, I think, in this county is how do we run our schools? Should you have school choice based upon whether you think your child is getting a good education? That's not a black-white problem. That's a user problem. You know, we want our schools to be good. I'm a product of public schools, and I'm embarrassment to many of those schools, I guess. But I grew up going to public schools all my life. I got a good education. I got a good enough education to get into a pretty good college. Got a good enough education to go on to graduate school and prepare me for life. That's what every family should want. How do you do that? You elect people who set the conditions governmentally to make those kinds of places successful. And same thing goes with police chiefs. Same thing goes with boards of supervisors. Hey, if you don't want data centers in your county, then you should have people who represent you or in the town or the county that recognizes that's the public's desire. Again, that's not a black-white problem. That's a citizen problem. And so increasingly what I'm finding that the issues that we're discussing are increasingly common to all of us and not necessarily a racially based subject. And I think that's where we make inroads in working together, to the degree that we can agree. So for example, I live on Vint Hill. This is a local issue. We have the old barracks. They look like, to be honest, they look like downtown Detroit before they started renovating it. It's an embarrassment to Vint Hill, and it's an embarrassment to the county. We've been trying to get folks to come in and renovate that, and we've had all kinds of bureaucratic falderall, causing delays in that. But to get fair housing, to your point, to fair, reasonable housing, that we're trying to get folks to come in there, a place for policemen, firemen, young teachers, nurses, where they can have an affordable apartment so they can actually live in Fauquier County instead of having to live in Culpeper County or in Orange County or out, even farther west where it's more affordable. So these, again, I'm saying, really, I think we've got the right to vote. Now the real issue is how do we figure out how to align our votes with things that actually improve our community, and to the degree that the things that affect your life, they're local and state problems more so. Well, there are national issues, but the people who create the rules that you live by on a daily basis, they're at the local and national level, and you ought to pay pretty damn close attention to who you're electing.
So first I'll say to my fellow panelist, Tim, I love the content of your responses, and what I mean by that is I can be a talker, and so you take as much time as you need. I'm not bothered by that, but I'm setting you up. No, I'm setting you up because actually what I really wanted to say was to my fellow panelist Barry. Don't you worry about the length of your response, right? The content's what's important, and you both have great content, and I appreciate that. I will say that the civil rights movement is as we refer to voting, is definitely relevant. As you may hear me, I've said a couple times already, and you may hear me say again, that the civil rights movement of the 60s, and when I say 60s, obviously I know it started before the 60s, but I just kind of put that in context there. And what came out of it kicked the door open for voting rights. And so, to your point, we're in a place now where African Americans and everyone else has voting rights, legal voting rights. I think the thing in our current day and age, and this is something that I preach to my 18-year-old daughter who's a freshman in college, and she has taken it to heart, and I can't tell you how excited she was to vote in her first election. Recently, she was just over the moon. I think the important thing is that now that we have that right, do what we can as a society to make sure that people use that right that so many people fought for and people died for, to have that for everyone, including blacks. I won't sit here and preach or give numbers about voter involvement, how many people actually vote in every election. But the numbers need to be higher. They need to be much higher, because, as I said, you have people who came before you who gave their blood, sweat, and tears, their time, and some of them their lives, so that the blacks can have the right to vote. So everyone who has the right to vote needs to go out and needs to make their voice heard. And to your point, Tim, that needs to be at all levels, not just wait every 4 years and vote for your president. It needs to be at the local level. Thankfully for me, as chief of police, I'm appointed, so I don't get voted in. I don't have to worry about that. I don't know if that's good or bad, but my dear friend Jeremy Falls, who I've known since kindergarten, is the sheriff of Fauquier County, and he does get elected, and I think that Fauquier County has a very good sheriff. I know that man's heart and what he'll bring to the job. But when there are injustices in the world, when there are things that are not right, when the people have seen that there's things that they want to change, they need to go to the polls, they need to vote, they need to be involved. Pastor McCullough was talking about our community action team. That is a way for citizens to get involved in the town of Warrenton in what their police department does. Our community action team reviews every month a police department policy. So 1 month we could be talking about use of force. 1 month we could be talking about something as benign as accident investigations. Another month we could be talking about how we do our internal investigations on our own people if there's a complaint. And I can't take credit for it. I am just carrying the torch. But my predecessor, Chief Michael Kochis, was the one who started the community action team. It was a great idea. It's not something that, at least as long as I'm there, will never go away, because it is so important and so needed as a way for the community to have a say-so in what goes in their community. So to that same point, voting is a way to have a say-so in what goes on in your community, and we need more of that. And so moving to what you might call, civil rights movement 2.0. Some people have said, these days civil rights 2.0, in what our community is doing to protest or in other ways to bring light to the problems that we have in our society. One of those things that I know is a big part of that is encouraging people to vote. Let's not just talk about what the problems are. Let's just not talk about ways that we can make them better, but then let's talk about what power we do have to make them better, and then to use that power.
Could I add just a quick aside? We track the statistics of voting in this county pretty carefully. This past election, 78% of the eligible voters in Fauquier County voted. That's actually really good by nationwide standards. So we do better than the average bear, the average county in the state and in the country. But that's not typical. That's a presidential election. This gets back to my point about local, state, and national elections. More typical is 55 to 60% for local and state elections. That means 40 to 45% of the eligible voters in a county who have the right to vote are either too apathetic or not paying attention or do not vote. So my challenge as a chairman of a political committee for the county, my primary responsibility is to get out the vote and to help Republican candidates, in our case, to get elected. And my counterpart, Max Hall, that's his charter as well for the Democrat Party. And I think I can speak for him. He has the same charter that I have. So the key for us is to figure out how we get our friends and neighbors who are recalcitrant about voting to get them energized that there are issues that actually affect their lives and that they can make a difference if they go vote. And I'm convinced that many of the people who don't vote don't think their vote counts. They don't think it has any impact. I would argue quite different. In Scott District, in the Board of Supervisors race the last time 2 years ago, guess what? The difference between getting one candidate and the other was 33 votes. 33 votes. That means if 17 people had voted differently, we would have a different supervisor for that particular district. So we got to get people out to vote. Black, white, orange, purple, polka dot. That's the problem we have right now.
Same thing could be said in the town of Warrenton because, I mean, the mayoral election was 11 votes. So.
Yeah, so and that's what I believe, the parties have a responsibility to get people out and their mantras for whatever their cause might be, but there should be a third non-biased segment essentially that talks about, hey, did you know that your voting place have changed? Because some people don't realize that their voting places that they voted for the last 20 years have moved to 10 miles out. Well, that older person that doesn't have a car or their cousin can't take them to go vote anymore because of whatever issues, there's no access for that individual to go out and vote. So granted, there might have been, you said earlier in Georgia they had the biggest turnout ever, but at the same time there was a grassroots level for getting seniors and people that did not know that their voting places have changed to get them out and vote. I don't think a lot of us rural counties realize that, 10-mile difference in a voting location means it could be a whole day for some people just trying to figure out a means to get there, right? So I think it's good that we go out and vote. I think there needs to be something ahead of time to let people know what we're voting for, because sometimes you don't realize until the day of that you're voting for a policy or that you're voting for a change because you might not be aware, because you might not be on that email distro or that you might not be reading the paper that has that information. So again, for me, it's about giving access to those voters so that way they can have enough time to say, hey, I need to get a ride or I need to get an Uber or I need someone to come pick me up to go to my new location to vote. And then when you get there, making sure you have the right documentation, because sometimes you'll be challenged like, hey, this is this district or this area to vote in. Are you aware that your voting location has changed? And then so it's just, again, it's access. So I think it's great that we brought up certain things. It's just making sure that we don't forget in the rural areas or even, places that you might have voted for the last 20 years, your location might have changed. So,
Yeah, and I'll just, add to that. I guess first, being in the church and, assisting people, that call, they don't have a place to sleep or whatnot. What we have found is that some of those people, even if they have the money, they don't have the documentation to rent the room. And the reason that they don't have the documentation is because they spent the last X number of years in prison. And while they were in prison, where they used to live, people moved, they didn't take and respect their stuff, and it got thrown away. So any proof of who they were is now gone. I mean, we could address that in the prison system, obviously, that before you release them to make sure that they have these basic, things that they need. You obviously know who this person is. So getting them a driver's license and a new birth certificate should not be that challenging as they're being released from prison. And so I can understand, the challenges that some people may have as far as showing ID, when it comes to voting, because you may be in a particular situation where your stuff was destroyed. You can talk about the wildfires or a flood. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why you may not have access to that documentation. The other thing that I would throw out, based on what Barry just stated, I think they solved the problem of getting people to the polls back then a way that we should be doing it now, but we're hesitant to do so, and that was through the church. There should be no one in the community who, with all these churches, with all their pretty vans and everything, there should be no reason why someone can't get to the poll. All you got to do is start up your van and go around and pick some people up and take them to the proper polling place. The other side of that is that in the church, we have gotten to the point where we think we cannot talk politics at all. What you cannot do is support a particular candidate. You can't direct someone toward a particular candidate, but you can talk about the issues that are upcoming on the ballot and how that would affect them, one way or the other. Let them make their own decision on which way they should go with voting for that particular ballot issue, but you can make them aware of that. You can allow, I'll just talk about what I do at Mount Zion. Candidates can come in, they just can't get a microphone, right? Because the worship service is the worship service, but you're welcome to come to the service, and after service, interact with whoever you want to interact with. That gives them an opportunity to ask you questions about what you stand for. But we've gotten to a point in the church where people don't necessarily want to do that. And that's not a violation of the Hatch Act or anything, of that nature, to just discuss the things that need to be discussed so we can have not just a voting populace, but an informed voting populace. Because there are some people, they just, depending on their political leanings, they'll just go look for that letter. They're going to pull the lever. They don't really care what they stand for. I've been voting this way forever. I'll never vote for that other side. When doing so, to your point earlier, Barry, it may not be in the best interest of the country or even yourself to continue to vote the way that you're voting. And so I think I appreciate what everyone has said there. I think the two of you gave a longer response to Barry's earlier response. But I do appreciate those responses. Let me go on to within the same speech. King stated the following: "There is another warning signal. We talk a great deal about our rights, and rightly so. We proudly proclaim that 3/4 of the peoples of the world are colored. We have the privilege of noticing in our generation the great drama of freedom and independence as it unfolds in Asia and Africa. All these things are in line with the unfolding work of providence. But we must be sure that we accept them in the right spirit. We must not seek to use our emerging freedom and our growing power to do the same thing to the white minority that has been done to us for so many centuries. Our aim must never be to defeat or humiliate the white man. We must not become victimized with a philosophy of black supremacy. God is not interested merely in freeing black men and brown men and yellow men, but God is interested in freeing the whole human race. We must work with determination to create a society not where black men are superior and other men are inferior and vice versa, but a society in which all men will live together as brothers and respect the dignity and worth of human personality." And so how do we protect against what King warned about in that segment of his speech? How do we protect against that? We'll start with Tim this time.
Let me think for a second. It was inculcated on me when I came in. Part of the leader training that I got was that you treat everybody with dignity and respect. You praise in public and you criticize in private. I think that comes down to fundamentally, like Tim said earlier today, is to have the ability to listen thoroughly to what your opponent or the person that you're having a conversation with has to say, and then trying to respect that, and if you have counterpoints, you present those counterpoints. I'm really concerned about the polarization of politics in this country, largely done by the media. So if you're a conservative, it's what you watch on Fox News or OAN or Newsmax, and if you're on the left side, it's MSNBC, New York Times, CNN, or something like that. And my view is, in many respects, they are not playing a responsible role in terms of shaping the issues and having respectful, productive dialogue about what's going on. And what's terrible about this is they typically portray your political opponents as idiots, or worse, as hateful human beings, evil human beings, which I think is fundamentally wrong. So we have to fight that. And the way you fight that is you start with your own personal behavior. And we have to teach our kids in church and in school how to have a respectful discussion and argument without it degenerating into a food fight. And so Max Hall, my counterpart, I wish he were here today. I think he would agree with me. Is we've tried to start that this year, between the Democrats and Republicans, and he and I did forums, and we would encourage anybody who wants to have us, where we openly discuss the issues, and we do counterpoint to the respective parties' positions. And if you have a good discussion like that, then what happens is the audience is paying attention, and they're sentient, they're thinking people. They will see which side has the better argument and which one sways the day based upon their interests and their values. And that's the key issue. What are your interests and what are your values? And does that party's policy, does it support or further your interests and your values? And so my sense is we've got to teach our kids. This is an education process, and we got to get it into our schools. We got to teach our kids how to debate and have an argument. We got to go into our churches and have places where kids youngsters, young men and young women can have these kinds of conversations without it turning into a brawl or a screaming match and something like that. And to be honest, our Congress doesn't help us much in that regard either. So we have if there's a long way to go, we have a long way to go in this country on figuring out how to do that. And my view is one of the many things I did in my misspent youth is I got a degree in philosophy, and I taught critical thinking at West Point for 3 years. And I think that's critical. It's something we don't do in our schools, and it's something we don't do in our churches, and something we don't do it at home. And we have kids who are ill-prepared to think critically. And we have to do that better. I've actually wanted to go to see the school superintendent and talk about offering him a course a basic course on how to think deductively and inductively. And my view is to the degree that we can start having people thinking about the content of an argument and how to challenge it in a respectful way, I think we make money on that. Barry.
So just looking back over his speech, I think that he hit it on the head. He said, God's not interested merely in freeing black men and brown men, yellow men, but God is interested in freeing the whole human race. So that just means that you have to have equality across the board, right, and equity as well. So with that, you can't worry necessarily about what your neighbor's doing or what your family's done for generations, or what you have to focus internally on yourself first and making sure that your values are aligned with whatever deity or whatever personal values that you have, right? So then that way, when you're going to the ballot to vote, you know in good conscience that you're doing the right thing, right? I think a lot of times we vote based on feelings, right? And feelings, like the media, they get you charged, right? And then when you're seeing stuff and you're hearing stuff repeatedly over and over again, it doesn't help with making a right judgment because you're invigorated, right? But when you sit back and just take the data in, and you see how this politician or how this congressman or how this local board of supervisors has been voting for the last 10 years or 3 years or 2 years, that's the data that you need, so that way you can make the right decision on, do you believe in the same values, or do you even correspond with the same values that individual has, right? And then that leads you to having critical conversations with your peers and your colleagues and your coworkers and your family to say, hey, I understand that we voted this way, or I understand that there's what it is, but this does not align with our values as our family, right? So let's leave it at that.
Chief.
I'll try to keep my response short. This question has brought up a lot of things in my head. I will agree with both of my colleagues here about their responses that they've had. I think it starts with the individual, right? It starts with the person. It starts with what are your beliefs, what are your values. But then expanding out from that, I think that when it comes to relations between people, let's just leave it at that. We don't even have to go into race, religion, sexual orientation, anything that. When it comes to relations between people, I think the biggest part of it is being heard. And this is something that my wife and I, just ingrained in our daughter growing up, is that there's a difference between listening to people and hearing people. We all listen, but are we actually hearing what they're saying? Are we trying to empathize? Are we trying to get ourselves into their shoes? Are we trying to understand where they see things from? I find that in my profession, I'm in my 32nd year. June will be 33 years for me as a law enforcement officer. I'm an African American man. And this is part, I tell you this because this next piece, because it is part of the conversation. I have a diverse group of friends and always have growing up. My wife is Caucasian. And our daughter, which she loves to joke about, if depending on what time of year it is and how much sun she gets, she can pass for Caucasian or she can pass for African American. She's I like to call her, she's a chameleon, basically. But why do I bring that up? Because really none of that matters. It's not about the color of our skin. It's not about any of those things. It's about trying to understand each other. And as someone who's been in the law enforcement field as long as I have, I find that I have to try very, very hard, especially the longer I'm in this field, I have to try very hard to make sure when I'm listening, regardless of who I'm listening to, regardless of what the topic is, regardless of what we're talking about, I have to try to see it from many different viewpoints. The most important one is the person that I'm listening to, the person that's talking. But also, there is going to be part of me is going to hear it from the viewpoint of a law enforcement officer, career law enforcement officer. Part of me is going to hear it from the viewpoint of an African American male who has grown up and seen things and encountered things in my time that are wholly different from what my father, who was born in the early 50s, encountered, but I still understand it on that level. I'll give you an example, just a quick example. One of my oldest descendants, as far back as I can go, her name is Louisa Williams, and she was a slave owned by James Marshall, son of John Marshall, on Leeds Farm, so right here in Fauquier County. And I know that through genealogy research that I've done. So, that inspires many different feelings in you when you know that about your ancestry, and okay, well, I have an ancestor who's a slave owned by someone in a very prominent family, not only in Fauquier County, but in this country. But then I also look at other things in the record, which is that when she was freed, and she had children at the time, when she was freed and she was no longer a slave, she actually was one of few people who got a very good start in her post-slavery life because of someone on the farm, basically an overseer on that farm who worked for James Marshall, who passed away and left her things like some cattle and some belongings, which back in that time period was cash. I mean, that was money. That's a way for you to start. And what I say those things because you take all those things together, and as Dr. King said, you have to look at, as we progress as a people, as we, using black people, as we progress, you don't want to look at what has happened, to look back on what has happened and say, okay, well, now I have more power, or now I have the power, and so it's time to turn the tables. That's not what this is about. It's, as Barry said, it is about I don't want to say getting what's yours, right? But we know what we need as people. We know what's important to us and what we're looking to accomplish. And we want to do that in unity with others. We're not doing that over others. We are no better. If we look back at our history and do not learn from it, as we know, we are doomed to repeat it. And so we don't want to do the same things that were done to us. And when I say the us, it doesn't matter what group of people I'm talking about. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about this country or in other nations that we've talked about, Tim and I have talked about. But we have to remember that as we strive for equality, as we strive for all of these things that we're looking for, we want the same for our brothers and sisters. We are all part of the same race, which is the human race. We cannot forget that part.
I did an interesting thing a couple of years ago. I sent in a swab for the genetic historian investigators on seeing who your ancestors are. You know, what does your DNA show? And what I found fascinating was, as you might guess, the large preponderance of my genealogy is tied to northern Europe, you know, Great Britain, but fascinatingly, I had a percentage of me that was from West Africa. I wonder how that happened. My point is this: I own a dog. He's a mixed breed dog. He's a wonderful dog. I love my dog. He kind of has traits of a terrier. He has some traits of a border collie. He's whip smart, but he's not a breed. Increasingly, and I don't say this to insult people, we are increasingly a nation of mongrels. What do I mean? We're increasingly like my puppy dog. We are just like your daughter is. She comes from family that has, you know, what we would have distinguished as black and white. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more children who have that kind of familiar background, including Barack Obama, who was our president. His mother was white, his father was Kenyan, I believe, if I'm right. At any rate, the point is that increasingly we have to understand that. To your point is we have a lot more in common, even genetically, than perhaps we thought. That's why the Pocahontas thing of Elizabeth Warren about her, 125th Cherokee or something like that. Well, there actually are a lot of us who have mixed backgrounds, and we ought to. One way maybe to respect each other is we all understand that we have more in common than perhaps we thought we had originally.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Again, I'm coming from, a Christian, perspective here. My responsibility as a pastor, teacher, according to Ephesians 4, is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry until they come to the unity of the faith. That has no color line there. That it really shouldn't matter what name is on the door of your building. We should all still be coming to the unity of the faith. But the other side of that is I also realize that not everyone subscribes, to my religious belief. But they are still made in the image of God, and they are deserving of the respect, dignity, and honor that comes with that image. They may not even believe in God. But if I do, and I believe that God created everything and everyone, then they are created in his image and his likeness, and I have to treat them with the same dignity and honor and respect that image demands. Not just, it demands that. And so if we were to look at people that way, in the similar way that we look at them as us, having, different ethnicities within us, or any other way that you want to look at people, we're all made in the image of God. And if you look at them from that perspective, then it's a lot easier to be respectful, even when you don't disagree, even when you don't agree with an individual. And so we're going to do one more speech here. I always put these things together like, we'll never have enough time to go through these things, but the discussions are interesting. And what I may do is use this as a springboard. Many of you are aware that myself and Pastor Holland, we have a podcast that we do on the fourth Mondays of the month, and we've slacked a little bit there over the past several months, due to a variety of things. But maybe we can use this as a springboard to bring these gentlemen back onto the podcast, as well as maybe some others, to go over some of these other speeches and to talk about this topic. But I'll have to have that discussion with him. And so this particular speech is, sermon, I should say, that King preached in Montgomery, Alabama at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church on November 17th, 1957. Now, I realize we're doing a whole lot of stuff in the 50s now. I do have speeches in the 60s, but I don't think we're going to get to those speeches, right? Well, actually, you know what? Let's do this. Since this will probably be the last one that we get to talk about. Let's go to the Lincoln Memorial Address that he gave on August 28th, 1963. Because just like anybody else, there was an evolution in his speech and his sermons, as time went on, and we want to respect, the evolution that happened there. So as part of his Lincoln Memorial Address on August 28th, 1963, King stated the following: "The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to distrust of all white people, for many of our white brothers, as evidenced by our presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny, and their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom." And it's interesting that I landed on this particular one because it flows right into what we just talked about. And so some of your answers may be similar to what you gave on the last one. And so, do you see in our society where all white people are being lumped into one group? Do you see in our society where all white people are being lumped into one group? I'll start with Barry.
So no, I think that every group is, all right, if you're ignorant, you lump people into one group, right? That's just point blank period, right? So, but if you have a sense of self-awareness and like to be enlightened and further education, realize it's all about the individual, right? So that's like, you can't group anything from race, religion, creed, right? So I don't believe that's a thing. But to the speech, I think that during this time, there was not as many advocates for us on our behalf. So, during that time, when you're not invited to the table, you have to have an advocate to speak on your behalf, essentially, right? So, and still to this day, I mean, we've come a long way. I think we're at a place where our ancestors have dreamed of being, but like we always say, we always have a long way to go. But the long way to go is again, like things like today, like having a seat as a panel, having a seat as a board of directors, having a seat as a CEO. I'm not talking about unqualified people. I'm talking about people that are qualified, that have done their due diligence and served their time and followed the trail or the job architect for where you need to be at today. And I think once we have more representation in those places, we have a better chance of not needing advocates. So then that way we won't lump people into a certain category because of what they look like or what they believe in, right? So
I do like how you qualified that. If you're ignorant. And again, ignorance is not a bad word. It's just a bad thing.
Right.
It just means that you're not aware. You're unknowing. And so if you enter any situation, like you said, in an ignorant fashion, you are more than likely going to come out on the wrong end, of that situation. Chief Carter.
I will agree with Barry. I can't say it as eloquently as he put it, but I do I do agree with him that no, I do not see that that all white people are lumped in to one group. But I will agree with him that if you have a certain mindset, and like he said, if you're ignorant, that I can see that may be the way you view things. It's the same with the reverse, right? If those who were ignorant of or didn't know any better, I guess is another way you could put it, or didn't see to know any better, in our past had preconceived notions and ideas about African Americans, about black people. So I don't see that, but I do think that it's in the individual, right? It's in the individual to decide who they're going to be, how they're going to feel, what they're going to do, And I was reading down further in this speech, just remembering this, and I don't want to get off topic, but it talks about when will we be satisfied, right, with what we're doing, and I think that it's important, that communication piece. It's important to change the hearts and minds of all people, right? We don't want to have the viewpoint or think to ourselves, because sometimes I think, especially in this day and age with social media and such prevalence, and I'm not one to say that social media is evil. I'm just saying with the prevalence of social media, a lot of times people are more in their heads than they are outside and interacting, right? They're more in their heads. I notice the younger generation, sometimes they have preconceived notions, ideas, doesn't have to be along race, could be along anything, but they've made up their minds before they've even set one step forward that things are a certain way. I can't go hang out with this group of kids because I don't know them, and that's not cool. And we used to call that's how you make friends. Go over there and talk to those people you don't know and you make friends. And now it's like, well, that's not cool. I can't do it. Socially unacceptable. And so I don't want to get too far off what we're talking about, but I do feel, much to Barry's point, that I think that there are segments of our population, there are people who may feel a certain way, may act a certain way, which may lead others to think that they can lump all people of a certain race, white people, for instance, that's what we're talking about, can lump them into a group and say, well, they all feel a certain way. One of the things that I taught my daughter, which I always told her to think about it this way because it really helps to bring the idea home. If you think about where we are, it's 2025, and the Civil War ended in 1865, and you do the math, that's 160 years, okay? If you look up statistics about the average life expectancy in the U.S., it's a little over 77 years. So let's just do this and let's just round up and say 80 years. If you say 80 years is the average life expectancy in the U.S., and it's been 160 years since the end of the Civil War, then we're only 2 generations removed from the end of the Civil War. And, take it any way you want, look at it any way you'd like to, but opinions, feelings, ideologies, those things that were in place in the late 1800s and the 1860s, those ideas have to be cultivated one way or the other. So you either have to move yourself out of a way of thinking, or you keep yourself in a way of thinking, and that gets passed down from generation to generation. So when we're talking about 2 generations removed just from the Civil War, and just over, if you just say 1860s, let's just go 1860, we'll use 1865, you're less than 1 generation removed from the civil rights movement, right? And so I think a lot of things, I'll just use race relations. A lot of things are fresh in people's minds still, and they're only 1 or 2 generations removed from those things that were happening in history, those time periods. Those things are very strong. And so I think what is important is the communication between people, to not make assumptions, to not think that, I know this is that way, this is this way. I will use our own beautiful town of Warrenton as just an example of that. I'll use the Black Lives Matter Vigil for Action, and I only bring it up in context of this conversation. I bring that up because many people know, but many people also don't know, that Black Lives Matter is not only an organization, it's also a movement, right? But it's also an ideology to do away with racial injustice. And I think sometimes in our country, it's not just our country, I'm sure it's other places, but in our country we have a tendency sometimes to grasp on to something and say, we know exactly what that means. That's the ignorance we're talking about. And to say, well, if it has something to do with Black Lives Matter, as an example, using this example, that it's got to be all good or it's got to be all bad. It's got to be one way or the other just because someone brings that up. But if you're bringing that up because you're using that as your ideology for doing away with racial injustice and for creating equality and more opportunities for African Americans, well, that's a whole different thing. And so I think a lot of what we're dealing with, in society in general, it doesn't have to be just on this topic, is talking past each other, listening but not hearing. So I'm sorry, it's a long response, but I wanted to make sure I got that out there. I set you up good,
All right,
Tim.
that's right. You're outdoing me, my friend. Hey, I'm going to offer two kind of different perspectives. I told you I taught logic and philosophy when I was in my early 30s. And there is a fallacy, it's called false universalization. That is, you see an instance of something and you attribute it to a broader entity, and there's no justification for attributing that broader characterization based upon the one instantiation of what you see. It's a fallacy, it's a logical fallacy. So if you see somebody who says, well, I saw 3 people who do this, therefore everybody who shares those characteristics is like that. There's also this theory called the black swan theory. I don't know how many people have heard that, but just because every time you ever saw a white swan, you assume that everything is a white swan until you discover that there is a black swan. That's an example of an inference, deductive inference that in fact that all swans are white because the only swans that you ever experienced are white ones. So again, I spent 30 years in the infantry, going to combat zones. Let me tell you this. When you go into combat and your life depends on somebody else in your squad or your platoon, you don't give a rat's patootie whether he's black, Hispanic, Chinese, Japanese American, whatever, Muslim American. All you care is he's got your butt covered, and that you can count on him. Of course, I grew up in the all-male infantry. Now we have women in the infantry. It would be him or her. That person is reliable and will cover your 6 and do his best to make sure that both of you get out of that environment alive. When you have that larger purpose and you have a shared interest in survival, it's really amazing how racial differences kind of fade into the background. And if you go back to, as many of you all know, military units have reunions, especially the ones that have served in combat together. And if you go to those, you'll see a really mixed crowd, and they're friends, and they really see themselves as brothers in arms. So my view is we still have lots of problems that we're describing, with what I call racism. If you block somebody and attribute a certain set of characteristics, particularly if they're negative characteristics, and you attribute it to an entire group, and it has to do with race, and that's called racism. So racism is a form of false universalization. And oh, by the way, if your life depended on the people that you apparently don't like because of that characteristic, your attitude just might change. And what you find is when you live in those kinds of conditions and you're sharing MREs or C-rats or toilet paper or whatever it is you need for the creature comforts of life, you really don't think about those things that much anymore. I mean, it might occur to you that that your counterpart's black or Hispanic, and you might joke about it and have a lot of good fun, but truly, your life is dependent on their performance and their behavior. And I suspect it's very much the same in the police department. So, and I'm sure it's the same in the Navy. So what you find is that after a while you develop a certain kind of camaraderie. And so what I'm saying is those environments cause you to break down the things that cause you to generalize about people and force you to look at that person as a person and value what that person brings to the table. And once you start valuing what that person does, particularly if that person's behavior affects your interests, i.e. survival, guess what? Race becomes really unimportant at that point. You start thinking of them as your brother as opposed to a black person or a white person or something like that. So that's the perspective I bring. And I can't say I'm perfect, but and we all tend to generalize about people sometime, but the goal is to fight that off and to try to look at somebody as having worth and can affect your life in a positive way. And if we do that, I think we're a lot better off.
All right, we are coming up on 11:30 here, so we're going to begin to wrap up. Again, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for joining me here today. And for all those who are online, we didn't get a chance to look at if there were any online questions or comments. I'll take a look at those, after this. And if anything needs to be addressed by any of you, I'll forward that information on to you, and you can choose to address it or not address it. And then for those who joined us here in person, we want to thank you for being here also. And I did invite some women to be on this panel too. I did. I sent out a mass email, but this is what I got. Amen.
Hey now.
But, I'm not even going to repeat that. But so as we wrap up here, I'm going to give each of you, just 1 minute to kind of give your closing statement, and then we will close out here for today. Barry.
I don't have much as far as closing. I just want to say thanks for a great conversation. Thanks for the invite, Pastor. I think, we highlighted some good things that you brought up in the MLK speeches. I think continuing that conversation just based on the progression of his speeches and what today's society is going through, I think it has a lot of self-reflection, at least for me personally. I hope my neighbor can understand, too, that we have come a long way, but I know it's a cliche quote, but I think we need to start holding people accountable on what's next for us to where we need to be at, right? So, and making sure that people have the means and the access and the information to better themselves, to make the best choices for themselves and for their family. So, I'll close on that. So, thank you. Yeah.
I think these show the inherent greatness of Martin Luther King in terms of laying down precepts that are invaluable for all of us to think about, and they are enduring. I think they will, 100 years from now, if somebody reads this, they will recognize the inherent truth of what he speaks, and hopefully will be in an even better position. As you well know, and the gospel of Jesus says, we are all mortals. We all have failings. That's why Jesus Christ came to us to save us, because we are all sinners, and we all make mistakes. And we do bad things, whether we intend to or not. So the idea that we recognize that, but still try to overcome that and become better human beings, I think that's a key message here. It's an eternal message, and I hope that 100 years from now, if we have a similar round table here with folks sitting around the table, that they will recognize that these are the things that probably we ought to aspire to as a society, and we live by them. So thank you for doing this. I'm really honored that you had me come today. I appreciate it, and I'm sorry I spoke so long.
I want to echo those sentiments. Thank you very much, Pastor McCullough, for having me here today. I'm honored to be here today with Barry and Tim, and to speak about these important things. I will keep mine brief, short, and sweet with a shameless plug here. I'm going to throw that out there. It's a shameless plug, but I'm going to do it anyway. It is a fact, and I'll speak to, as you can see me sitting here in uniform, it is a fact that, an unfortunate fact, that law enforcement in our great country has been in the center of many things that have happened, and many of them involved with injustices done to our people. It's the fact of the matter that when anything happens, people usually call the police first. And I'm not just talking about the citizens, but governments get involved. And so the police, unfortunately, sometimes are the ones on the front lines of enacting, unfortunately, in our country's history, some laws that were very unfair. And so those law enforcement agencies, those law enforcement leaders who have seen the history, who understand the history and see where we're going today and see where we are, they're trying to make a change. And I would like to throw myself in as being one of those who wants to do that. And I have to do it at the level that I can do it at, which is the local level. So I implore any of you out there listening, if you want to make a change in the town of Warrenton, that's what we're trying to do, trying to make our community better, trying to make our police department better. Please look into our community action team. We desperately want volunteers, and we are always looking to take applications for people who want to be part of that. You're basically just devoting your time. You know, we're not going to ask anything more of you of your time, although time is important and time is precious. But we need good people to help with the direction where our police department is going. And I'm biased to say that I think we have a good police department, but we can only get better. We're here to serve the citizens of the town of Warrenton and any visitors that come in. And I think it's very topical in what we're talking about today, in what Dr. King stood for and what he was trying to do. Much to Barry's point, I think we've come a long way. We still have work to do, right? And that's not a bad thing. But we need to not forget that, and we need to constantly be moving forward. So, again, thank you, all of you, for participating today. Thank you, Pastor McCullough, for having me here. It's been an honor.
All right. Then again, I just thank everyone for being here. And if you're available, please join us at 1 p.m. for our MLK celebration right here at this location at Highland School. And then also, we will also be streaming it, to Facebook and to YouTube. But if you can get in your car and come on down, we'd love to see you here. Right? There's no need to just sit at home in the comfort of your home and watch it. You can come down and celebrate with us right here at Highland School. So thank you once again. Thank all of you once again. God bless you. Heaven smile upon you.